For the last 5 Sundays, I've been so blessed by the Real Conversation series, and I don't know about you, but there have been messages, testimonies that have really impacted me. Boy, some of the testimonies, I normally sit somewhere over here and I look out, but people are shedding tears and just really being blessed. So I've been blessed by all of that. But I'm going to switch gears today because we're going to go back into the book that we've been studying for the whole year, which is the book of Romans. And I'm going to kick off the second half, which is chapters 12 through 16, which will be in for the rest of the year. But I want to kind of just briefly review some of the theological concepts that we learned so far. The first is depravity. We learned, and Paul lays out a case that each one of us is guilty, deserving of God's wrath. We sin not only through immorality and idolatry, but we sin through religiosity that's self-centered. And no one is exempt. Romans 3:10 and 11 says, none is righteous, no one seeks for God. And the conclusion is in 3:23, for all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And the worst news is not only are we breaking bad, but we are incapable of being in a good place. We cannot earn our way out of our badness. The second concept we kind of learned is justification. It is like a legal term, and Romans 3:24 says that Christians are justified by His grace as a gift. It's not something we learn, but it is given to us as a gift. At the moment of salvation, the person who receives a gift, or the Christian, is instantaneously and irreversibly declared not liable for condemnation. Are we not? We started as being broken bad, but we are forgiven. The third concept that Romans taught us is propitiation. It is a term that really only evangelical Christians kind of use. In verse 23, verse 24 continues the redemption that is in Christ Jesus. And he continues in verse 25, it is through the blood of Jesus that we receive propitiation. It means that Jesus paid it all. All to Him I owe. Sin has left the crimson stain. He washed it white as snow. Jesus paid it all. The fourth concept is sovereignty. In Romans chapter 8, there's a wonderful verse 28, which tells us that for those who love God, all things work together for good. God is in control, though sometimes it doesn't feel like it. And finally, he crescendos to the end of chapter 8, and he tells us at the very end, nothing and no one shall separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus our Lord, to give us the concept of security, that God will not give up on us, even though even as Christians there are times we want to give up on God, we backslide, we fall into sin, but God does not give up on us. And so having said all of these wonderful things for 11 chapters, basically saying you don't deserve love, but I've loved you in such a way that is a gift, and my love for you will not change. It is not conditional. You have received an undeserving love. So I've been laying out this case, this remarkable set of truths for 11 chapters. And he turns the page, and this is the hinge verse, chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. And the apostle, the pastor Paul, he writes to the Christians at Rome, and he says, therefore, because all of this is true, because you have been loved in a way that you do not deserve, you can't even imagine it, and even grasp. Therefore, I urge you by the mercies of God. In a pastorally way, he's appealing to them, and in an apostolic way, he is commanding them. And he tells Christians that they need to be understanding and doing two really important things. We need to give our bodies, and we need to change our minds. We need to present our bodies, and we need to transform our minds. And I want to talk about these two things. First of all, we need to present our bodies, which is logical worship. And verse 1, I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Now, let me ask you, church, when someone mentions to you the word worship, what comes to your mind? What is worship? I know at the Living Hope culture, when someone asks you, when is worship, you would automatically say, well, I think it's Sundays at 8, 9:30, and 11:30. That is our worship service. And we think of worship as the activity that we do on a Sunday with a church community. It involves some singing, it involves some listening or teaching, and sometimes stories, and sometimes a video. So that is worship. But when you bear down a little more, we think, worship is, and in fact, we kind of accentuate this idea because we have a worship band. So we have a group of people that's worship, and Robbie and Ben are like worship directors, right? So we think that worship service is what we do, or we're doing now, but worship is when we start doing it with melody, when we sing back. So that's what we think of worship. So when we read chapter 12, verse 1, present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. You know what kind of subconsciously comes to our mind is, okay, this must involve something to do with Sunday worship or singing or something. The way that things worked back then in the New Testament era is the Apostle Paul or someone would write a letter to a church. So he would write it or have a secretary write it. It would be in a scroll, and it would get hand-delivered. And the leader of the church would take the scroll, and on a Sunday or Lord's Day gathering, he would unpack the scroll, and he would read it aloud to the congregation. Hey, we have a letter from the Apostle Paul, the Pastor Paul. And he goes through these 11 chapters. And there's the former slave. And he's just weeping because he's told he's no longer a slave. There's that person who grew up without a mom or a dad on the street, and he's told, you've been adopted as a son, and Abba, Father, you can call him. And he's weeping. And there's that woman back there who's racked with sin, who's been told that her sins have been justified. And on, and they're just getting wrecked with the truth of chapters 1 through 11, the gospel of Jesus Christ. And then the leader says, I appeal to you, brothers, men and women, Jews and Gentiles, all of us, young and old, by the mercies of God, not because you've earned it, it's out of grace, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable, which is your spiritual service of worship. When we hear that, we hear it's like a general idea, but I contend with you that none of us in this room would hear that in the same way that the Jews and even the non-Jews would have heard it the first time when they first heard it in Romans 12. And the reason being is because none of us have actually experienced, smelled, touched, or seen an actual sacrifice, an actual offering done that way. You see, when a Jewish Christian would have heard this, he would have thought of Thusia in this way, that even when he was young, his dad would read to him Leviticus chapter 1, the account, a mandate of how they ought to do burnt offerings. And he remembers that their family had livestock, goats and sheep and bulls. And during these certain holy days, Dad would go out and pick the cleanest, most healthiest male one that doesn't even have any open wounds or scabs. And he would bring that animal and lead the animal with the family to the capital, Jerusalem. And you kind of wondered why we had to give the best of the animal, because you know, as a child growing up, you fell in love with a lot of the animals, and the prettiest, the healthy was the one that you kind of gravitated toward. But Dad said, we need to give the best because it's a gift for the Lord. And your father would take that animal and go to the entrance of the temple gate and would talk to the priest and would hand over the animal. And you would try to peek, and what you know is that they would slay that animal that you raised, drain its blood. You would skin it, or the priest would, and they would cut it into pieces and burn portions of it. And from afar, you can see the smoke billowing. That's what you grew up with, thinking is an offering, a sacrifice. So when the first hearers heard Romans 12:1, they didn't think about music or a comfortable chair or air conditioning. They thought of that. And I believe their emotional reaction was completely different. For the first reader, I think what they would have thought is to give your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable. They understood it as giving their best. You see, in Leviticus chapter 1, verses 2 and 3, it says, "When any one of you brings an offering to the Lord, you shall bring your offering of livestock from the herd or from the flock. If his offering is a burnt offering from the herd, he shall offer a male without blemish." Leviticus 22 also specifies that that animal cannot be blind, fractured, maimed, have any running sores, eczema, or scabs. I can't be even one of those animals. Those of you who have eczema or scabs, you don't qualify. In order to be an animal that is acceptable, it's really the best of what you had. You know, one of the problems with us really relating is that the closest thing that we kind of relate to in terms of giving an offering is later on, Ben will come again and we'll have a response set, and he'll say something about offering, and then the basket will come by and you're trying to praise, and someone will tap you with the basket and go, "Oh yeah, okay." And then, you don't have your check ready or whatever, and you don't really do checks anymore, so you let it go past, and you're hoping that people will think that you're giving online, and so you do that. But if you think about it, what is it that you own? What is it that you can give? And it's really just dollars, and whether it be dollars, like physically, or by check, or just electronically, there is no sense of an unblemished dollar or a blemished dollar. Does that make sense? So if the worship leader says to you, "Hey, it's time for offering, would you, the Church of God, give your unblemished tithing to the Lord?" What does that mean? Right? But these Christians understood exactly what that meant. It meant not giving your last fruit, but the first fruit. It meant giving the best of your animal, not the lame of your animal. It means, and as the first readers would have heard this, it means giving your bodies, yourself, the best of yourself, not the worst of yourself, or the second best of yourself. And that is the rightful response, the logical response, the spiritual response of being loved in an undeserved way. Yesterday, two of our primers, which is our single adults, got recategorized as home builders, meaning they got married. Okay, so in our database, we're going to change their classification. And it was a wonderful wedding ceremony. Pastor Ben was here, and the groom and the bride were here. And Pastor Ben did this thing, his wedding ring is all nicked up on the outside, but really smooth and clean on the inside. I thought that was just brilliant. And our family, we had to kind of do this. And that's so true. The difficulties of life roughs up our our outside wedding band, but the inside, if you know, etc. And they exchanged rings and such. And I think they're here somewhere. The couple, I'm not sure. But what if the bride finds out later on that the groom who bought the engagement ring or the wedding ring went to Tiffany's or Jared's or whatever and got a really good deal because that month when he went wedding ring shopping, there was a BOGO sale on engagement rings. Buy one, get one engagement ring. Welcome. You're in luck because, yeah, you buy one engagement ring for the love of your life, and we'll give you a second engagement ring for someone else you might want to give that to. Right? What's your budget? Right? And the guy's thinking, I can, get this, and oh yeah, I'll get, instead of this, I'll get something different. So this cut of this and that cut of this color of that, this color of that. I don't know how that works, right? I don't. So he gets two, and he's thinking, okay, which one should I give to my wife on our wedding day? Okay, by the way, this did not happen, so don't go telling the bride from yesterday that he did this. And by the way, if that sale ever happened, don't do it, okay, man? But she's going to want to know, okay, if you did buy my ring on a BOGO sale, at least did you give me the better one? Right? Or did you give me the one that you think economically made sense and that there's a better return for the other one? Did you give me the cubic zirconium or the one with the flaws and it's not crystal clear, whatever. I don't know. If you are professing love to the person that you're going to love for the rest of your life, you're not going to give the second best, would you? But you would give the best of who you are. Isn't that what we do? And this is what Paul is saying. If God has loved you this much, shouldn't your response be to give the best of who you are? Not the second best with your time, your energy, your schedule, etc. And the first reader not only would have realized what God is demanding of the child of God is to give the best, but it's to give sacrificially. It is to give sacrificially. In Leviticus chapter 1, it says, "He shall lay his hand on the head of the burnt offering, and it shall be accepted for him to make atonement for him. Then he shall kill the bull before the Lord, and Aaron's sons, the priests, shall bring the blood and throw the blood against the sides of the altar, that is, at the entrance of the tent of meeting. Then he shall flay the burnt offering and cut it into pieces." So you brought your animal, this animal that you loved and you raised and was the best that you had at home, and they go and what do they do with it? They slay it, they kill it, they flay it, and they cut it into pieces. They drain the blood out of it. What is the imagery that the first reader would have understood? When he first heard that, I think what he would have heard is, what? Is God demanding that I climb upon the altar alive and light myself on fire as a human sacrifice? And it's certainly not what God is saying, but I think the sense of what God is trying to communicate to us is this: a worship is when we actually sacrifice to the point where it hurts. And the English word sacrifice has this religious, ceremonial type of a nuance to it, but it also has this nuance of sacrificing something. Our modern Western church, because we're so pragmatic and individualistic, there's a sense in which we look at church as and worship as a way in which we gain something. And so we come every Sunday and we think that I hope it's worth it, that the speaker would be funny or make me cry or make me inspired. or at least the music should. And if it fails to do that, I'm going to go to a different movie theater or a show. And if it's too much trouble for that, I'm just going to Netflix church. By the way, I think that's a brilliant idea. I hope people don't do it, right? But that's what we do sometimes, don't we? We just podcast and half-heartedly listen. What God is saying to us is that shouldn't the right response to the gospel be, I'm gonna worship in such a way that it hurts. Sacrifice isn't a sacrifice unless it hurts. If it doesn't hurt, it's not a sacrifice. The early church would have not only understood that this means not only giving the best, not only giving until it hurts, but they understood that it's giving to the glory of God. Verse 9 of Leviticus chapter 1, and the priest shall burn all of it on the altar as a burnt offering, a food offering with a pleasing aroma to the Lord. They brought the animals from all of the different worshipers. They killed it, they skinned it, they drained the blood, they chopped it up, and they burnt it up. Not grilled it, not smoked it, not barbecued it, but they burnt it up. We're, like I said, celebrating our 26th anniversary next week. And what if we announce, okay, church, next Sunday, to celebrate God's faithfulness to us, so that we would thank God and give Him honor and praise and worship, we're going to have a BYOM Sunday. Bring your own meat Sunday. Okay, so bring your own meat, and we're going to worship God by the meat that you bring. And so, some of the people bring like sirloin, others bring a T-bone and tri-tip. Our college students are bringing like chicken tenders and right. See, they don't deny it, right? I'm bringing with some others like a fish, and then our vegans here are bringing tofu firm, and hoping that counts as a pleasing aroma to the Lord. And a lot of you know that I am an immensely practical individual. Unless it serves a purpose, I'm not sure why it exists type of a person, right? And what I would do, I get excited and bring the hospitality to Paul Yoon, come, Doris, David and Shara. Look, next Sunday we're going to have hundreds of pounds, maybe 1,000 pounds of meat, right, David? Right? You can work with that, yeah. And can you work with that? I can work with that. Okay, let's buy soy sauce and whatever else we need to do to marinate. We're gonna have to feed next week like over 1,000 people. Let's do this. What the priests and the worshipers did at this time is people did bring the meat. They cut it up, chopped it up, and they gathered around and burned the meat up. They just burned it up. And then they said, okay, now we got to feed the 1,000 people. What do we do? We would have thought that was immensely impractical, waste of money, and not a good steward. I want you to understand the concept here. And I think partially the reason why God did all this is because we would understand that it is not a pleasing aroma to you, but it is a pleasing aroma to me. Worship is not for you, but it's for me. And not everything that you do, whether it be passing out bulletin, hitting on a snare drum, directing parking, making coffee, teaching children, praying, singing choruses to a song, not everything benefits you or someone else. Sometimes, and underlying all of it should be that it needs to please God, because you're saying ultimately, thank you, God. And we have a difficult time with that. There's a story of Jesus one day saying to two of his disciples, John and Peter, hey men, we're going to go on a hike. Get up. And before we go, I want you to do me a favor. Do something for me. Peter, James, each one of you bring a rock. And so John goes and finds a rock about the size of a cantaloupe and puts it in his pouch. And Peter walks around and finds a pebble the size of a grape, a small grape. And puts, he's kind of like, Jesus said rock, and it's kind of technically qualified. So he puts it in his pocket because he doesn't know, what the rock is for. And so they're hiking. It's a hot day, and they're walking for a while. During the full sun, midday, Jesus says to the men, "Okay, men, it's time for lunch. Get out your rocks." And so John brings out his cantaloupe-sized rock, and Peter brings out his pebble. He thinks technically it's a rock. It's time for lunch. And he lays his hand on the two rocks, and they become manna. And he says, "That's your lunch. No sharing." And John's eating, this is the most delicious pastry I've ever. It's like I'm in heaven. And Peter just has enough. You know how sometimes when you just have just a little bit, like a sampling, it's even worse? Peter takes a bite of this is so good, but I'm even hungrier now. And he just kind of like, Gets home. Next morning, Jesus says to the men, "Peter, John, get up. It's time to go. Let's go on a hike. Do me a favor. Can you go find a rock and bring it?" And so John goes and finds another rock the size of a cantaloupe, puts it in his pouch. Peter now goes and finds the biggest boulder that he can find. He's just like, you can barely lift it. He has to put ropes around it and, makes a harness that he's carrying around. And they're just like, they're walking, and Peter's just like sweating, and it's so heavy. And he's just getting tired, but he's just dreaming. Yeah, yesterday I just had a taste of that manna. I can't wait. Oh boy, lunch is going to be so good. During midday, they get by a creek, and Jesus says, "Oh, time to unload your rocks. Can you, men, throw them in the river?" And so John throws his rock in the river, and Peter's just like seething. "Jesus, I carried this rock all day in the heat. It's heavy. I was carrying this rock for you." And Jesus turns to Peter, "Did you carry that rock for me or for you?" Isn't what we do in the name of Jesus oftentimes for our own sake and not really for Jesus' sake? So that when the burden that we carry, Jesus says, "Yeah, throw it in the river, and I'm going to get glory by that," we do so. Or if he says, "No, I'm going to turn it into bread so that you can be nourished," and we say, "Thank you." Worship, sacrifice, means not only giving our best, giving sacrificially, but giving not for our benefit, but for the glory of God. When we experience the love of God, what should naturally occur is that we want to give our bodies, ourselves, the best of who we are, sacrificially for the glory of God. The other thing that should happen is that we ought to transform our minds. It says in verse 2, "Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what the will of God is, what is good and acceptable and perfect." He says in the negative, don't conform yourself to this world. Don't bend yourself to the culture, its value system, its attitudes, and its affections. And that's the default state that most of us abide in. That's the kind of beings we are. But instead, it says, "Be transformed by the renewal of your mind." The word "transform" is metamorphosis. That's the word that we use to describe what happens to a caterpillar that becomes a butterfly, right? Now, I didn't really know a lot about metamorphosis. I think is it a superhero character? It sounds like it should be. But the only really thing I knew about caterpillars turning into butterflies is like Hungry Caterpillar, the little children's book that we used to read, or like from Bug's Life, the caterpillar suddenly sprouts away. I thought all these years, I thought that when the caterpillar goes into that cocoon or spreads the cocoon, that inside because he's not eating anymore, he just goes into an extreme diet and he just gets really skinny. And that he somehow sprouts like wings. That's kind of what I thought. But in order to preach this sermon, I actually researched, studied what happens in a metamorphosis. What surprised me was this. When a caterpillar goes into a cocoon, it releases enzymes into his body, and the enzyme attacks the body and turns the whole body into goo, like a liquid, a thick liquid. So if you cut open a cocoon at a certain right time, what you get is not a form of a caterpillar or a butterfly, just goo. And from within there are these seeds of the wing, of the antenna, and things of that nature. And what Paul is trying to say is transform your mind, die to the caterpillar, and the imagery is so wonderful. Like you almost have to die as a caterpillar in order to be reborn as a butterfly. But the problem is that we sometimes try to stay a caterpillar and still try to fly. And we try so hard to fly. And it gets so burdensome and hard, and we become bitter and cynical. Do so, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. A renewing of your mind. It doesn't mean just get more knowledge. It doesn't mean simply have a change of attitude, but allow your minds to be impacted by the truth that was given in chapters 1 through 11 to the point where not only is it in your head, but it impacts and changes your affections, your heart. If it's just here, it hasn't transformed you. It is when it's here, it transforms you inside and out. So much of the Christian life is still up here for many of us. And it's because we haven't tested it and approved it. We haven't treated it as if it was real, the will of God for our lives. What would it mean to know that we are completely depraved, and if it's really true? How would our thinking, our lives, our affections be different? How would it change if to know that our salvation really was justification by faith, by grace, nothing that we've done to deserve it? How would things change if we know that it is propitiation, that Jesus had to die on the cross for me? What would change if I knew that God was completely in control? Would that change how anxious and worried that I would get? What would change if we knew our security that God will never abandon us? And what if we tested it to the point where it's not only in our head but in our hearts? That's transformation. I'm going to end with this story. A bunch of years ago, and the band can come up at this time. A bunch of years ago, I traveled to New Jersey to spend the weekend at a church and speak at the retreat. If you don't know like the geography of New Jersey, where the church was, it's kind of northern New Jersey and right by New York. And so a lot of the families there, a lot of people there, they live in New Jersey. It's kind of like the suburbs, and they work in New York, which is like downtown. So it's like, living in Fullerton or Orange County and commuting to downtown LA, right? Some of the people who work in Wall Street, for example, they have high pressure jobs. The person who picked me up from the airport, I was talking to him, so what do you do? And he works in investment banking, and he said he manages hedge funds. So he's a managing director of a hedge fund, or I forgot what his title exactly. And I didn't really understand hedge funds. I'm a pastor, I don't know anything. I said, but I did know certain words, so what's your portfolio? How big is your portfolio? I thought he would say something like, hundreds of thousands to impress me. He didn't say hundreds of thousands. He didn't even say millions. He said like billions, several billions. I forget the number. I was just so stunned, and I didn't actually, because I didn't know anything about hedge fund. I didn't know if that was impressive or not. I go, oh, okay. And he talked about the work-life balance and how difficult it was to commute there, come back. how so many families, they do this, investment banking, people burn out all the time, etc. And it's almost, at their church, it was almost impossible to have anything midweek in the evening. I thought, wow, that's rough. And then I got to the retreat, and I started spending time with parents and teenagers. I thought our catapult students had it rough, that the pressure to get to like a UC school, wow. I don't know, maybe it's because of this group of people, but it was just at a different level. It was like, you should shoot for the Ivies, one of the 10 Ivies, but really, you need to shoot for one of the HYPs, Harvard, Yale, Princeton. And if, there's like a level, if you get into one of the other Ivies, oh, that's nice. Oh, Penn State, okay, that's cute, or UPenn, I mean, yeah. And because New Jersey is relatively a small state, there are not a lot of public schools, so it's not like, oh, I'm longing to go to the University of New Jersey at whatever, Montclair, that type of stuff. You have to kind of go out of state and pay out of state tuition, et cetera, et cetera. Among these families, what I was surprised by, and they would do all sorts of stuff, but among these families, the ticket that oftentimes they held was there's this one particular prep school that everyone was trying to send their kids to, because this prep school, if you go through it, a high percentage, the majority of the graduating kids end up at one of the Ivy Leagues. And I remember talking to one student who felt like a failure because she didn't get into this prep school, this high school. I thought, wow, what a lot of pressure. And so I can tell the families were talking about how they want to get their child into fencing or archery because it hasn't been saturated, and my child can get into like the Olympics of national archery, things of that nature in her weight division, and it'll look good on their resume. They don't like archery, but still, it'll make them stand out and things of that nature. And then I talked to one couple who didn't have, older couple who didn't have kids, at least at the retreat. And I was talking, tell me about yourself, et cetera. And they said they had 2 kids. I forgot the other one, but they had a son who graduated from one of the HYPs, undergrad, and went to grad school. And I said, wow, congratulations. That's, but they didn't seem happy at all. And they explained, our son not only doesn't go to church anymore, but has walked away from the faith. But I was trying to he's doing what he really wants, as you go. And what they confided in me is that, no, he's miserable. He's just miserable. Because he's been told all his life by us and himself and his culture that really what you need to do is succeed as the culture tells you to lay everything else aside and you get there. And if you don't get there, you're considered a failure, but if you get there, you should be happy. And he got there, one of the few, he realized this is miserable, he doesn't belong. What Jesus says to us, what God says to us is transform our minds. We have to understand and believe the will of God, the principles, the truth of God, and what if it really is true? Can we test it? Can we approve it? And that will change us from the inside out. Otherwise, listen, we'll only be caterpillars trying to fly, and that's just not going to come.